I came out to my mum first because obviously I knew, like, my mum at least had a vocabulary for this stuff. And she just said the immortal words, which was, "Oh, don't be silly. There's nothing wrong with being gay. It just means something went wrong in the womb, that's all."
From Mamma Mia, I'm Mia Friedman, and you're listening to No Filter, candid conversations with fascinating people. Do you remember when Pauline Hanson was elected into politics in the mid-90s? Author Benjamin Law was in high school back then on Queensland's Sunshine Coast. He'd grown up in a really white area, but up until that point he hadn't really thought much about his race. Sure, he knew he was Asian Australian, but that had never been really a problem until Pauline Hanson made her maiden speech in Parliament.
I and most Australians want our immigration policy radically reviewed and that of multiculturalism abolished. I believe we are in danger of being swamped by Asians. Between 1984 and 1995, 40% of all migrants into this country were of Asian origin.
All of a sudden, it was a shock for Ben to discover that his ethnicity was associated with something negative. His family was seen as different. He was an Asian Australian, his parents were divorced, and he was gay. Ben Law has gone on to become one of Australia's most respected journalists. He's also the creator of the hit SBS show The Family Law, based on his memoir of the same name about growing up with his family on the Sunshine Coast. And it's now in its third season. He's also been in a relationship with his partner Scott for more than half his life. He's a really interesting guy, a great ally to women, and our conversation was really funny. Here's Benjamin Law. Welcome, Benjamin Law.
G'day, Mia Friedman.
Can I call you Ben?
Yes, you can.
Or Benji?
Look, the only reason I have Benjamin Law and everything is when I say, "Hey, my name's Ben," everyone says, "Hi, Dan, it's lovely to meet," and I don't know whether to correct them, and I might have a speech impediment that maybe your listeners can hear that makes Ben Dan, but Benjamin, and then Ben is so fine.
Well, Dan, you describe yourself as an Asian Australian closeted gay kid of divorced parents who grew up in an overwhelmingly white conservative part of coastal Queensland during the height of anti-Asian Hansonism. So basically the classic Australian story.
The classic Australian story. Rebecca Gibney
said.
could play my mother, really.
Tell me about growing up in that way at that time.
You know, when you lay all those bullet points out, it sounds like I would have been bullied or felt really oppressed and all that sort of stuff. But actually, I had a really great childhood, and I was like one of very, very few ethnic minorities at school. Like, there were just so few people from, like, whether you were a religious or racial minority, it was just really waspy. But I didn't notice it that much. I mean, I knew that I was Chinese Australian, of course. I'm not blind. But it was either not really that commented on or it was kind of an asset because I came of age, well, I started school in the late 1980s. So that was World Expo. Multiculturalism was this huge, proper enshrined policy in Australian government. Sesame Street was big, I guess. And everyone just thought I was this huge novelty in class. I was this shaved head Asian kid because I used to get the clippers and everyone would rub my head for luck, like in the school line because it just felt so good too. And I was much shorter than all of these other white kids. And they just really liked me and I really liked them and it was totally great. I gave them chopstick lessons. They were actually interested in my food. I was never teased or anything like that. But then later it did change in the mid-90s and I noticed that change very palpably because suddenly you've got Pauline Hanson and One Nation version 1 railing about Asians. And it was the first time where my ethnicity was conflated with something negative that I felt. I mean, obviously, if you look back on Australian history, right back to the gold rush. No, I mean, this is a country that kind of federated on anti-Asian sentiment in a way. So that all existed, but it was the first time I was cognizant that race could be a liability or that was something that people didn't like about you. And that was really confronting and discombobulating, and it changed the way that my friends spoke about race around me. Parents would start coming to school with vans emblazoned with the One Nation logo because they were running as candidates. I always say that One Nation in its first iteration had two strongholds. It was like Tolkien's The Two Towers, and the first one was Ipswich, where Pauline Hanson had her seat. And the second was the Sunshine Coast, where I grew up. It was really, really really strong One Nation territory, and even now the state leader of One Nation is in the seat of where I went to school. And so all of those things kind of combining, and the fact that I was gay, and the fact that Queensland was the last mainland state to decriminalise homosexuality, I had a really charmed childhood, but teen years were far more
Fraught.
angsty. And it was the 90s, Mia, as well. So you add that and you're listening to a lot of, Tori Amos and
Alanis Morissette.
absolutely, Jagged Little Pill. And so, yeah, childhood blessed, teen years a little bit pretzel-like.
Every teenager is acutely embarrassed by their family and
yeah.
fearful that their parents and their family are weird and that other people might find out. Is that how you felt about your family?
Completely. I almost wonder if that's a biological thing. Is there a biological function of why, as kids, we just adore our family and we adore our parents so much, and then as teenagers, like, you repel me, you disgust me, you embarrass me? I mean, maybe that's a part of becoming an adult and leaving the nest. But for me, because my family was so different, because my parents separated when I was 12 years old, which was like quite a big thing to do. I remember at school we would have a thing called the Buzz Book, which was like the name of every family by last name, their street address and their phone number. So it was like the yellow pages for every family. And it was always a big thing every year when the Buzz Book came out. It's like, who's been listed as a single parent? There was a huge stigma against it. And so I do remember, it's seared in my memory when we were the Buzz Book family that became like a single parent household. And it's so conspicuous. It's so public. That was one reason to feel kind of out of place and slightly embarrassed.
How did your parents tell you they were splitting up?
Oh, we were a part of the argument that saw them split up. There's a scene in the very first episode of The Family Law, which is a show that I co-wrote and created. And for all of that show having fictional elements, because, it's based on a true story, it's inspired, it's not a documentary, Mia. There is a scene at the end of the last episode where Jenny, the mum, kicks Danny, the dad, out. And that scene, almost beat for beat, is based on stuff that actually happened.
Yeah, right.
And so there was that to be slightly embarrassed.
For people who haven't seen, how does it play out?
Okay, so Jenny and Danny start having an argument that is one thing that is totally unrelated to all the other things that get brought up, in any kind of brutal epic fight between two people in a long-term relationship. Then it really digs into the core of the relationship where Danny crosses a line in the argument and he says, well, you basically don't even work. And the whole episode we've seen Jenny do nothing but work, but it's unpaid domestic labour, like so many women especially are familiar with. And that's just a huge breach in their relationship, because it's like, how can you say I don't work when I'm taking care of these kids? And she basically throws him out. And similarly, even though my parents' arguments were about slightly different things, that's basically what happened. Like, mum threw dad out when I was 12 years old and we just kind of like looked on as witnesses. I look back on that time and I think what an incredibly strong and brave thing to do by my mum, and also like have reservoirs of sympathy towards my dad in that situation too. But it really did, getting back to your original question about embarrassment towards your family, it did trigger off this period where I'm like, oh my God, we're the freaks of the school. Also, now that Hansonism is pointing out our Asianness as being weird, like that makes me feel much more self-conscious. And my family was just hilariously strange in their own way anyway.
As everyone's is, but your mother is quite the character.
She is. It's funny. People always ask me when they watch The Family Law, oh, surely, like, that's an exaggeration. And I'm like, well, funnily enough, everyone who's actually met my mother says, wow, that is a PG-rated version of your mother, isn't it? She's pretty wild. She's really frank.
Well, having read your book and having listened to an interview with you and your mother, and also the two of you write a sex and relationships column together.
It's not something that a lot of people get to say, is it?
No, it's not. I would concur with the fact that what's on the screen in Family Law, the TV show, is a PG version.
It's a dialed-down version.
Yeah.
My mum likes, she's a Queenslander, so she can really use her swears as well.
Yeah.
And she's really, really frank about things about the body, about reproduction, about sex, that we can't really euphemize in a way that's completely kid-friendly for the show. So we strip that back.
What did you grow up being taught about Like, how did that manifest itself in? Because you're one of 5, you're number 4?
I'm number 3
number
of
3.
5, so right in the middle.
And there are 2 boys, 3 girls.
Uh-huh.
How did it manifest in what she taught you all about sex and your bodies? And
The funny thing, Mia, is I don't remember her teaching us about sex. It was just there from day one. And I guess maybe because there were so many kids, like the mystery of anything is gone. We were in a 3-bedroom house, and by the time my parents split up, there were 7 of us. So there is no kind of pride. I'm not saying that, we saw things or heard things or anything like that, but everything just becomes a bit more blunt about how things work. And I think for us, there was always the conversation about how sex worked. And secondly, it wasn't The Joy of Sex, but a very similar book just about positions and stuff that Dad had in his study. And it wasn't exactly locked away. Like, it was in the study, so that wasn't our go area, but it was easy enough to sneak in and look at what sex looked like. And back then, I have to say, people still had pubes. So I think we had a very healthy, loving representation pictorially of what was in that book. Maybe it was too lush, maybe it was too fecund. But, people looked like they were naturally. And it was just like, I think the way that I think about sex now, which is there are biological functions to do with it. A lot of it's for pleasure. Some of it's funny. Some of it's cheeky. Some of it's serious. And I think we got the full gamut. We also watched like a lot of SBS from a really young age. And I don't think it was just about, Cantonese language programming either.
It was always the nudie-rooty part of SBS that was the secret
Completely.
among kids.
Synonymous with like just boobs and ass and the occasional schlong because they got European films.
And pubes.
And I remember reading through TV Week and looking for, the things on SBS that had MA brackets SAN, and that was sex and adult themes and nudity. The trifecta. Because, we were growing up in analog times, Mia.
In the first episode of the first season of Family Law, it actually opens in a scene in the family's Chinese restaurant.
Yes.
And it's your character's, but not your character, it's your birthday.
Yeah.
And there's a cake that comes out and your mum is giving a very detailed explanation of how you were born and how you came out of her vagina. And imagine it's just like a lemon coming out of your penis hole.
That's
imagine how
right.
that'd feel.
And in real life, that monologue just went on and on and on much further. But I have to thank my mother in so many ways. I mean, for so many things. But there are passages in the Family Law where I'm like, I really don't have to flex my muscle as a screenwriter for this because I'm just going to take it from stuff she says. Lemon out of a penis hole. Yep, that's always been burnt in my memory.
And in your other places,
And
I imagine.
yeah, absolutely.
So you said that in the 90s and with the rise of Hansonism and most notably, you also mentioned that Queensland was the last state. I think
last
maybe
mainland state.
Yeah,
last
after
mainland
Tasmania
state.
was something
Tasmania
ridiculous,
came like 7 years later after Queensland.
How much internalising of homophobia and racism, looking back, realised that you had done based on the state of things
So much.
where you were growing up?
Recently I was having a conversation with some friends and even I had this conversation with my siblings, which is like, what are the things that you love now that you really kind of despised growing up or in your teens and 20s? And one of my things was camp men, which is really awful to say, but I would always have this thing where I would see, Julian Clary on TV or watch the Mardi Gras on TV and I'm like, oh, they're just ruining it for the rest of us. How stereotypical, how cliche. Now, of course, I'm a Sydney gay. Like, I embrace all of those things. And whenever I hear a lisp or a camp voice, I'm like, my people are here. But it takes a lot of working out of your system because not just growing up in Queensland, but growing up in coastal Queensland where there's a premium placed on masculinity. And I think more broadly, that's a very Australian thing. We're really geared towards masculinity to the point where I think even probably like a lot of women feel that kind of thing where like a lot of masculine traits are virtuous just by virtue of being masculine. So I think I internalize a lot of that stuff. The fact that, poof and fag were just synonymous with crap. Gay was crap. All of that stuff. You come to a point where you're like, okay, my sexuality is gay and I own that and I'm proud of that, but I don't want to be like the others, the others that are like this or like that and they're just walking cliches. And I think that's also really dangerous because if you just see a one-dimensional representation of a person as cliched. Like, it's not their responsibility to show you that they're a complex human being. It's your responsibility to lean in and find those complexities in someone. And I don't think I realized that for a really long time. And I feel like I probably blocked a lot of people out of my life because I prejudged them in the way that I didn't want to be prejudged. And it's a real missed opportunity that I think a lot of young queer people do similar things, where they recognise themselves, when they've been ostracised or bullied, and they're like, well, I don't want to be that person. And by extension, I don't want to be associated with that person. So they'll actually just back away. And even now, where I think, like, in some ways it's probably hopefully better for some younger queer and questioning kids, sometimes I do talk to younger queer people, and they talk about that, how there was that other queer kid in the school, but they didn't want anything to do with them because they didn't want to be associated with each other.
It could have been dangerous as well, right?
Absolutely, where you're just kind of like seen as the queer block, and
because you need to go, but you also need to go under the radar.
Yeah, especially if you're closeted, you want to be on the down low. Absolutely. Yeah. So that's homophobia that I've internalized. And in terms of racism, I was having like a really interesting conversation with a gay friend of mine the other day who's also Asian Australian. And he said that it wasn't until he entered the gay world that he encountered racism. So for him, it was encountering like how exclusionary mainstream gay culture can be, and the fact that, you know, a lot of Grindr profiles or a lot of dating profiles, they'll be like, you know, no fats, no femmes and no Asians. Like, these are the things that go hand in hand, which are synonymous with being undesirable.
Can you explain what that means?
Well, I think
no Asians is self-evident.
Yeah, well, people might be putting on their profile what they're into, and then by extension, a lot of people would put on their profile what they're not into. And a lot of my single queer friends talk about this, where they're like, you go into a profile, and so often it's like they don't want bigger people, they don't want people who are heavy, they don't want feminine people, so no fats, no femmes, and the third thing often is no Asians. And then there are, you know, variations of that where they don't want South Asian people like approaching them, so they'll go like no curries. There's a lot of racism endemic in the gay world, so you know, it doesn't go just one way where a minority is oppressed and they're not capable of oppressing anyone else. But I think because
Did you have that experience too?
No, I'm lucky because I've been in a relationship, in a solid relationship, for a hilariously long time now. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so you haven't really been out there.
No, and I feel kind of lucky for that in that way. But I know, you know, talking to my friends, that's pretty endemic. But with race, at least, I feel like I had such a charmed run in childhood. You know, Mindy Kaling, who's the American comedian who has like a South Asian background, she always jokes about, you know, my parents raised me with the entitlement of an ordinary white man. And so I kind of feel like I relate to that as well, where there was never any question as to whether I belonged in Australia or not throughout my childhood, where to the point where in my teen years where there was question, I was just like, well, that's bullshit. Like, I immediately knew it was bullshit. It didn't shake my understanding of myself in Australia, but it did shake my understanding of Australia.
When did you realise you were gay?
Oh my gosh. I mean, part of me wants to say kindergarten, because I do remember like just being infatuated with this like beautiful blonde boy called Cameron in a way that was different from my infatuation with girls, because I was completely infatuated with girls. Like, they were pretty, they were funny, they were just better company, they still are. But then Cameron was just someone different. Like, I was just like in awe of how beautiful and handsome and charismatic he was. And I think I was probably at an age where I didn't know to hide that either. And we were friends, and I feel like when I got through primary school, there was another friend who I had that same experience with. And it wasn't like, you know, I needed to love them or be their boyfriend or anything, but I was like, I adore you so much in a way that's so different from the way that I adore girls.
It's funny, people don't ask, when did you realise you were straight? As I asked you that question, I thought that. But then I thought, well, if you asked me that, I would also say kindergarten, and I could tell you about a boy called Joel, who I also was just obsessed with.
You're Joel,
in
my
a different
Cameron.
way.
Yeah. And you know instinctively that it's something different to the way that you love your friends, because, you know, like all my friends I've been infatuated with, but in a different way. But then I think it does change during puberty, because then you're armed with the vocabulary and the hormones. And
You know what
those
it means.
And those two things mixed up provide a very heady brew of, you know, feelings and emotions and, you know, physical responses that you can't control. And then that becomes something that's quite, I think, lovely. Like those primary school crushes are quite lovely, to something that's really quite scary, because then you know what people are thinking of you. You don't want to be that thing. And then there comes a process where, you know, coming out, I think, involves several processes depending on the person. And for me, it was one, understanding and acknowledging that I was gay. And then the next step was actually being able to articulate that and being okay with it within myself. And then the third thing was building up the courage to hopefully ask if other people were okay with it. You know, it goes on for a while and it ricochets in your brain.
Is that
a lot.
years that goes for?
I think so. Like, I think, you know, when I left primary school, we were a bit younger in Queensland, so it would have been about like 11 or 12. And then from then on, you know, puberty hits, and yeah, that fear and excitement and desire is all mixed up, and it takes ages to process, because you don't actually, I mean, I didn't actually want to come out, because that would be admitting so much. And it's funny because, like, I've been out for over half of my life now, and I feel like, you know, if anything, I'm super gay. Like, my public profile is attached to my sexuality in some fundamental ways as well. But when it came to writing about this, whether it was for my book, The Family Law, and then later the third season of the show where we explored this, they weren't far from the surface, those feelings. Like, I could just snap back into it. I remember how the anxiety, the denial, how torn up you feel inside. And that's from someone who actually looks back and really feels like he had a good run.
And it went well for you.
Yeah,
I mean,
went
without
really
it being
well.
a spoiler alert
Yeah.
for season 3, you come out to your parents, and there's some of the most beautiful scenes, and I cried because they were just lovely.
Yeah.
Not that there wasn't angst along the way,
Of course.
and fear and misunderstanding and anticipation and hesitancy, but do you think that at the time your coming out story was typical or not typical, or is it impossible to generalise?
I think in some ways it's atypical. I mean, let's look at different contexts here. Like for a Chinese Australian migrant family, I think that's pretty atypical. I know that because I've got cousins. I know that because I've got friends within, you know, the broader Asian community, and more specifically the Chinese Australian community. And it is hard when, you know, you do come from a different culture and your conversations about sexuality, I mean, even discussing sexuality is so hard in a lot of Asian background families, but obviously not in mine. So I had this advantage that I now look back on. And for all of my embarrassment that we were talking about before, that was my mum's asset and my asset when it came to me coming out to her. So I'm so grateful for that. I do think as time goes on, I realise that it's atypical. One, because by the time I was 17, I felt so old. I'd been keeping this information for so long. And even now when I talk to other people who are, you know, even significantly younger than me when they come out, they often come out in their 20s. And I'm like, wow, I was kind of relatively young to a lot of people's other stories. So I think that's kind of atypical. And like you said, my parents' response to me was really lovely. Like, I have dramatised essentially the responses in real life.
Can you talk about what the real life response was from your mother and your father? Because they're two of my favourite phrases.
Yes. So I came out to my mum first because obviously I knew, like, my mum at least had a vocabulary for this stuff. And it's still terrifying, couldn't come up with the words, just became a blubbering mess instead. And she had to play this awful game of 21 questions of like, what's wrong? Okay, something's wrong. So you've gotten your best friend pregnant. No. You're on drugs. No. Oh, you're gay. Yes. And she just took that moment. And similarly to in the show, she just, you know, hugs me really tight. And she just said the immortal words, which was, oh, don't be silly. There's nothing wrong with being gay. It just means something went wrong in the womb. That's all. And like as much as I find that so hilarious and wrong now, just so hilariously wrong, at the time that felt deeply comforting because like from her, understanding my mum and the fact that her second language is English.
And she was taking it on herself, wasn't she?
Absolutely, yeah.
In a well-meaning way.
In a well-meaning way. And with her understanding of sexuality, at least at that stage, it's like, well, it is, it's a variation from most people's sexuality. So, but that variation must be biological. So it must be something that just happened in the womb. Something went wrong in the womb.
Yeah, I mean, wrong part, but it is like, it is a variation on Gaga's Born That Way.
Yes, exactly. It's Jenny Pang's version, my mum's version.
That's right.
And unlike in the show, so in the show I've dramatised it that I came out to my dad next. And I did come out to my dad next, but it was many, many years later because he's much more of a typical Chinese dad where you don't discuss sexuality and you don't even really discuss relationships with your dad. And my dad's conversations even now are very much about practical things like have you eaten? How's work? Are they paying you enough? What's your, just like really kind of like dad, son, practical chats. And so when I told him, he was like, oh, okay, does your mum know? Yes. Does your sister know? Yes. Does your brother? And I was like, oh my God, too many siblings, too many family members. You're going to go through the entire family. And he did. And then he was like, oh, well, yeah, it's okay. It's very popular nowadays. And so I was right in a trend. I was part of the zeitgeist, Mia. And, if one day you want to be normal, that's okay too. So both of my parents had these hilariously wrong responses, but baked in love.
Yeah.
And
from a beautiful place of acceptance
completely,
of you.
And framed by their capacity and understanding of sexuality at the time.
And English as a second language.
Completely. So, that stuff's pure comedy. Yeah. So, of course, it has to become comedy.
Your life changed in 2000. You say, in so many ways. You've written and you've spoken about that year being a really significant one for you. What happened?
So I moved out of home. So my last year of high school was 99. Moved out of home in 2000 and then just became really gay. I think there's that first year of people being open about their gender or their sexuality. We all talk about it. You become really militant and you become the boiled, undiluted queer essence of yourself because you've been holding it in for so long.
Right. And what did that look like for you?
Oh, for me, it was like joining the queer club at my university. It meant my birthday's in September, so I was starting university at 17, Queensland. So I didn't get to go into clubs till I was 18, but I still remember the first night. I was just like, I'm 18, just get smashed at a gay club, making out with people I've never met before. I still had braces at the time, Mia. It was so gross. It was so hilarious. But you've been watching all of your heterosexual friends for years at school, have crushes, talk about their crushes, make out with each other. They're kind of affirming the heterosexuality from a much younger age. They've got a head start and you are watching them with deep joy that they get to do that with 95% resentment and envy. And so when you get to do that, you really go out. And then also not having a sense of humor about anything for quite some time. You cannot use that word in that context. It would take a while for me to find my humor muscle again.
I guess you're in a defensive crouch.
Yeah.
For that first year.
And you become really I'm kind of a political animal now, I think, but really politicized about the politics of queerness. You get all that history that you haven't been exposed to because, we learn history at schools, but we do learn it from a very particular lens. It's only much later that, right now I'm doing a project on Chinese Australian history. I'm like, wow, this country has this whole other story that I don't know about. And if you look at it through the queer lens, whole other story we don't know about. You look at it from a female lens, where were all of these stories when we were growing up? Indigenous lens, oh my God, that goes back 65,000 years and we didn't get any of that. You just, you switch the lenses and you see different stuff. And so you get, coming out as queer, there's a whole history and culture and community that I'm not aware of. But the way that I think my life really changed was hooking up with my man, really. That was a big thing.
Where did you meet?
We met in high school, Mia. So I actually knew my boyfriend Scott in high school. I'm older than him, and when your year level's different, you may as well be universes apart in a school. I'm not going to talk to year 11 scum. But then he started working for my dad's restaurant, and I'm like, wow, your hair has grown. You look like a man now. I'm going to have me some of that.
Did you know he was gay at school?
Well, here's the thing. I was never picked on for being gay at school because I was as picked on for being gay as much as anyone else, in that everyone was called, epithets, and that came to me, and I had more reason to be fearful of it, but it wasn't directed just at me. People couldn't see past the fact that I was Asian. They couldn't process that I could be two things at
not
once.
Two things, there's too many things.
Whereas Scott, he was so sensitive, and he was kind of picked on, and so it was kind of more known and conspicuous. So I did kind of have the hunch that he might have been one of mine. And so that hunch was confirmed through alcohol. I think if Attenborough did like a documentary about Australian youth, it was just like the Australian youth courts now with a bottle of passion pop. And that's certainly what I did.
So how did your relationship develop? Were you out by the time he was working at your dad's restaurant?
Yeah, like aggressively so. And I think he was not as much. Because I think when other people call you out for your sexuality, you hold back because it's like, well, I've been picked up on it. I'm not going to be that person. And so I feel like I take responsibility for teasing it out of him.
How old
sounds
were you?
Slightly graphic. I would have been in my late teens, so 19.
And he was about 18.
Yeah, he was about 18. Or maybe we were even younger. Look, it's all a hot mess, and I'm really bad at maths, which is terrible for being an Asian. But we were young. We were still in our teens. Yeah.
And did it happen fast? Was it on and off? Was it tumultuous? Was it just set and forget? How's it proceeded? It's been what now?
Oh, my gosh. It's been so long. Like, it's been...
How old are you now?
Someone asked me the other day, and I actually had to think about it. I think you get to your mid-30s and you actually start forgetting how old you are. I'm 36, turning 37.
Okay, so it's half your life ago.
Yeah. And we've spent about half of our lives together. Yeah, it's been like at least 15 years. We've done a lot of long distance. There was a break there. But in that time, like really, we've been like the constant in each other's lives. Yeah.
And before marriage equality, I've heard it described to me by gay friends that same-sex relationships didn't necessarily always have that predictable trajectory of hetero relationships.
Yeah.
In that, when you're straight and you used to meet someone, it's like, oh, when are you moving in? Oh, when are you getting engaged? Or when are you getting married? When are you having kids? But it doesn't necessarily, that expectation or that checklist isn't so much there in a same-sex relationship.
No, and I actually have always found that kind of liberating in a way.
It would be.
And you have to talk to each other far more clearly about your expectations, because I feel like my straight friends, who are all like feminist and really like progressive, and they want to have those active discussions about who does what in the household, but you are still loaded with this social historical baggage of what a relationship is supposed to look like, what your milestones are, and
milestones, that's the word.
Yeah, and because in some fundamental ways, obviously, we were blocked off from options, but in other ways, you had to forge your own options and to carve out your own. And so for me, one of the things I always point out is, my partner and I have been longer together than any married couple we know of our generation. And in some ways, like we've never thought about exchanging vows. And now that it's an option, we're probably still in the same headspace, but who knows? But I kind of feel like you kind of have to renew your vows daily in a way internally. Like, we're not bound together by marriage, so but what are the other things that bind us, and are they still important? You make an active effort to do that. And I'm not saying that married people like are just lying back on marriage. There's always an escape hatch. But I think for us, not having had that option has meant that we've had to actively think about, like, what is keeping us together? Is it worth it? Is it worth it? And I think that's a really healthy thing.
What have your milestones been?
Our milestones have been... Sorry, I was just about to say, milestones have been, I was going
I
to
was
get
going to
graphic.
say, have there been, the G-ish rated one, or the SBS rated one.
The
Go for your
SBS rated
life.
one.
This
No,
is a podcast.
the milestones have been, well, look, hooking up. Then another milestone was, I think, like the first time we did long distance because we decided to stay together.
How long had you been together by then?
We'd only been together for like a year or so. And then Scott did an exchange in Hong Kong, and that was for half a year. Oh, my God. What? Like, part of me is just like, why do we stay together at that time? And it was really hard, but it made us engage with, like, you know, is this worth it? Is this too hard? What are we in this relationship for? And holding on to that. I think that was a kind of a big milestone. I think a big milestone was like moving in together, which was precipitated by the fact that my share house got fleas and that his share house had like one of his like French flatmates drop an egg behind the oven and didn't clean it. So, I mean, like, as much as I want to romanticize why we moved in together, there were also like deeply practical issues, Mia. First death in the family. And I think when you have experience, like, this isn't like a peripheral loss. Like, a lot of people, and you get to your mid-30s, people die, but to have like a loss of like a parent, a family member, someone in your nuclear family, and to be there with that person, you know, I think that's a huge thing to walk alongside someone with. And we were really young when we had that kind of loss, and you grow up very quickly and you grow up together and you help each other through that. And then moving interstate together, which, like, moving is hell generally, and then moving states is like another dimension.
Puts a lot of
of
pressure
hell.
on a relationship.
Yeah, and I think
Well, was one of you the trailing spouse in that situation?
look, I kind of for all that I've done with work, I think the people closest to me know that I don't have like 1 year, 5 year, 10-year plans. I'm just kind of like, well, it's going well. I'll just do this now because, okay, cool. Scott does see what he wants to do, and he was like, well, look, we're going to move interstate now.
What does he want to do?
Well, he's the head of like a whole new arm of the ABC. So, you know, he's had a career in radio and stuff like that.
He works in digital media.
Yeah, that's right. Which is an exciting place to be, Mia.
It is, Ben.
So he initiated it, but once we got to Sydney, it was the best thing. It was like so rejuvenating to be in a new city. We knew fewer people in Sydney than we knew in Brisbane, where we came from, or Melbourne, and it was great. It kind of felt like we were young and new again because we introduced ourselves to a city and the city introduces itself to us. And I guess we also thought, what is it like to live in one of the most cripplingly expensive cities in the world? And it's been an adventure. And to go on that kind of adventure together.
That's very bonding.
Yeah. I mean, what do they say? I mean, like marriage, travel, death, moving. Like these are the things where you really see your partner for who they are.
Kids?
The funny thing is, so we're in our mid-30s, so prime breeding age.
Your eggs are getting old.
Exactly. I'm feeling them shrivel. But the thing is, so this means that all of our friends have just exploded with kids.
And your siblings.
Yeah. Oh, or actually, my oldest sister has stepkids because she recently married. But all of the siblings, we've just been deliberately barren so far.
Well, I've seen some uncle postings on your Instagram.
I've got a lot of kids that are really dear to me in my life, you know.
Okay, so it's uncle in quote marks?
Completely. And so uncle in quote marks, gay uncle. And the more I hang out with them, the more I know two things. One is I love kids and I need them in my life, and it's so important for me to be around the kids who are important to me. Like if I go a week without seeing certain kids in my life, like, you know, it feels wrong. And the second thing that's reaffirmed is I don't want them because my love for them is so strong. I don't feel that urge to have any of my own because I feel invested in these kids' lives. And also the responsibility is, I don't think it's a level of responsibility, but it's a completely different kind of responsibility to the responsibilities I feel capable of. And that's not putting myself down. I feel like we're all capable of different kinds of things. And it's a skill set that I don't have. And it's a skill set that I'm not sure I could develop either. Like I feel like I've got a really good uncle skill set, but the parenting skill set is brutal. And I don't mind being brutally disciplined with my work, but I just don't think I could do that. And again, like, that's not me putting shit on myself. It's just like sometimes we know what we're capable of and have an interest in too. So I know I'm going to be at these kids' graduations. I know I'm going to be there on their 21st birthday. Hopefully they're going to be there at my funeral.
I was going to say you might be there at their wedding.
Oh, yeah, and all of that
Slightly
stuff.
more positive spin
I know,
on it.
but I'm just like hurtling towards climate change and the death of me and the death of the planet, Mia. But
Is Scott on the same page?
yeah, funnily enough, because he's only child and I'm one of many. So early on, my mum, just seeing what my mum endured to raise us, and she did such a good job, and so did my dad. But it's a slog, So I saw firsthand, and because my sisters are significantly younger than me, what it takes to like raise a really, really young child. And I didn't think I really romanticized it. You know what I mean? I'm just like, that thing poops a lot.
So much.
Yeah, and because Scott is the only child, I think he denies this, but he was just like, oh yeah, kids, okay, yeah, like how could that work? And then I think we started hanging around our friends' kids, and
Some
he's like,
real ones.
wow, that is intense. And I'm like, no, that is not intense. That's not intense. That's actually just a kid. Like, that's what's involved in kidding. And he's like, okay, cool. And similarly, like, he's so, like, my heart just grows when I see him around our mates' kids, because he's so good at being there for them, and being this really nourishing figure in their lives. And I don't want to compromise that role in a way. Do you know what I mean?
I do. I was going to ask you, since marriage equality was legalised, have people started putting the hard word on you?
I have mixed feelings about this, because when people like say, have you got any plans to get married now? There's like half of me is like so grateful that I'm now included in that conversation.
In that intrusive pressure.
Yeah, I mean, and you've nailed the second half of me, which is just like, oh my God, it's so annoying. Like, all of so many of my straight friends are always like asked, whether they're in a relationship or not, when are you getting married? When are you getting married?
Yeah.
And similarly for them, like, I don't really like want to think about it, and I'm not interested actually. And now it's going to be like, and we're going to have the discussion where I talk about why I'm not interested, and will that offend you as a married person, and all of that sort of stuff. So I mean, when people ask me whether I want to get married, there is a part of me that's like, thank you so much. And also, how dare you?
Yeah, it's like a privilege to say none of your business.
Yeah, completely. And I'm all there for it.
And even the expectation, even my question about, are you going to have kids? Like,
yeah.
10 years ago, 20 years ago, that would not be a question that you would ask
No.
a gay person.
But I love that that's happening now, because I've known, for queer women especially, it's much easier to have a kid that way. But, now we've had so many rainbow families around us and rainbow kids, that we now know like some guys of our generation who are doing it. And it's like really interesting to see that template play out, because, when there's no kind of model in front of you for what that should look like, you kind of forge your own. And I don't know, I just love seeing my friends, straight and queer, just making these kind of daily miracles with their children. It's really gratifying.
Because once upon a time, when a child would come out to their parent, part of the angst of the parent would be, but it means I'll never be a grandparent.
Yeah.
Whether they were male or female.
Completely.
And now that's not even
an issue, because there are options and means and ways. Like same-sex adoption, that's a relatively recent thing that's been allowed, and surrogacy. And to have those options now has really changed a lot of my friends' options, who are really interested and passionate about being a parent. And it's thrilling to see. And in terms of marriage, I've been to one same-sex marriage, Lucas and Adrian. They just pulled out all stops. Like, it was the most beautifully extravagant, gorgeous wedding. And I'm about to MC another same-sex wedding, my friends Bali and Adam, and I love it. Like, I really love being a part of that ritual and ceremony, and I really feel like it is important. Whether it's for us, that's another question, and I'm not sure it is now, but things change.
Just finally, you're a wonderful ally. you're very active on Twitter, and I've noticed you work hard to be an incredibly strong ally to women, to people with disabilities, to First Nations people, to trans people, of course, to LGBTQI people as well. But I wanted to ask you about the work of being an ally. How do you be a good ally to a group that you might not be a part of?
I think to ask. I mean, I think you just did the right thing right there, which is to ask, to not assume anything, to not assume you're necessarily using the right language, to not assume that you're doing the right thing by someone. It's to consult, because I am not a First Nations person. I'm not a woman. I'm not a trans person. I don't come from a religious minority. I don't want to screw it up, essentially. And so I think just having an open conversation with someone is fine and is probably best practice, because then you'll learn, you know. And I think it's also, I mean, and some people might respond to you and say, look, I'm actually really exhausted and I've explained myself a lot and I don't want to have that conversation again. And that should be okay, because we've also got this thing called the internet, which has a lot of information about how to be an ally too. And I don't proclaim that I'm always the best ally either. But I think
you're very deliberate about it.
Yeah, but I think there are like two camps of people. I think there are people who assume that they're doing the right thing by everyone, and then get, you know, really angry when, you know, when things aren't, you know, when they find out that probably has you know, rubbed people the wrong way. And I think there are people who are like, oh, I want to do better. How can I? And I'm always learning. And also, similarly, there are people who will accept that and some people who won't, unfortunately. And, you know, one of the things that I keep coming back to is that I think it is possible to come to a place of humility without humiliation. And I think, like, you know...
what do you mean by that?
Well, I think as time goes on, social media can become a pretty ugly place. And I think public shaming is, you know, there is this whole spectrum between criticism and witch trials. And I think, like, really instructive, collaborative criticism is so important. You know, how else are we going to learn? How else are we going to grow? And there have been so many times in my online career where people are like, dude, that's not on. And I'm like, my first animal reaction is like, well, I was trying, and I think you'll find in this research report, blah, 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 blah. You know, like, that's a really human animal part of us. Where
talk about your response to Me Too, because I've heard you talk about through your thinking, your internal thinking process in the face of Me Too, and how you came to the point of being an ally to women.
Well, I think if you're a man in the Me Too era, and I'm even saying this like as a queer man, so I feel like when Me Too started, I'm like, that is awful, but I'm not a part of this conversation. I have no culpability, not responsibility. # not all men, I'm gay. And then what I started seeing, because God, I mean, Me Too is like such this movement, but I still palpably remember when it first started, where it was every single one of my friends, even my female friends who don't usually post that much, were like, this happened to me. And it was kind of shocking, actually. Like, obviously I'd heard a lot of these stories, but a lot I hadn't. And to know that basically every single woman I know had experienced abuse, assault, or harassment, or all three, was like really confronting. And again, I thought the best way of being an ally was just to give people space and let them tell it, which is kind of true, like that they need the platform. But having the platform for too long, and I know this, you know, from, say, a racial minority perspective and as a queer perspective, having the platform for too long is also exhausting. And that was really felt during the same-sex marriage postal survey. One of the things that like really made me emotional during that period was when my sisters like hung up a rainbow flag, they're both straight, hung up a rainbow flag, did a letterbox drop around their neighbourhood about why they're voting yes, and if you vote no, we'd love to have coffee with you. All my straight friends and cisgender friends going out to the park and doing the telecalls. I didn't have the energy for that. And I understood there would come a point with Me Too where women would feel exhausted too. And they started saying that. I remember so many of my friends were saying, men, you have a place in this conversation and we are angry and tired. Where is your voice? Where is your allyship? And that's when it kind of forced me to examine, well, one, what can I offer? And two, What does that support actually look like? And also, like, what is my behavior in all of this? And examining myself, I realized, I have done, yes, unintentionally, but who cares your intention when the result is harm? Like, I have, like, for instance, I remembered one of my female friends was asking me how much I got paid, and I withheld that information from her because I was like, well, our boss has told me not to tell you, even though I knew I was being paid more. And that was such a shitty thing to do, Felt so awful about that. I've told female friends before, hey, look, don't hang out with that guy. I know him and I are friends, but if I was a woman, I don't think I would be. Like, where does that come from? Why am I covering his tracks? Why am I making excuses and accommodating for his bad behavior? And when you just dig in a little, like, I'm not saying I've sexually assaulted someone because I haven't, but that doesn't mean that you get off scot-free from all these other ways where you might have really undermined people in your life that you care about. And I think all of those things are on a spectrum and worth examining.
So where did you land?
Where did I land was just talking about how I hoped I would change. And I actually put those examples and more of my shitty behavior because, we can all be shit people, just out there. And men identified with that and realised, and of course I got so many responses like, well, I'm not a rapist, Benjamin Law. And I was like, well, that's not the conversation that we're trying to start. Me Too is about, serious assault and harassment, but it's also about how those things are seeded from pretty crappy attitudes that we've all been socialised with. That doesn't justify it, but it does explain it. And we should be able to say, hey, look, we've been responsible for this behaviour and I'd like to take responsibility for it now.
Well, thank you for being an ally for so many people. I've learned a lot about how to be a good ally by watching you.
Oh, thanks, Mia. Thank you. I feel a lot of people, including myself, feel the same way of you.
Well, thank you. You're a wonderful ally and a beautiful person. Dan, thanks so much.
Bam!
I meant all of it.
She knows her craft. That was like pure comedy gold.
Thanks for listening to No Filter this week. If you want more from Ben, you can check out his show, The Family Law, on SBS On Demand. No Filter is produced by Eliza Ratliff. Please tell somebody about the show if you like it. If you like this interview or any of the others that we've done, share it. Share it on your socials. Send it to someone in a WhatsApp group. The more people that know about this show, the more shows we can continue to make. I'm Mia Friedman. Thank you for listening, and I will see you on Mamma Mia.